Bienvenue, everybody. Welcome to the Juntas Podemos webinar. For those who don't know me, my name is Mónica Ruiz Casares. I'm an associate professor of psychiatry at McGill and a coordinator of the Global Mental Health Research Seminar. Our webinar series is supported by the McGill Global Mental Health Program, the Quebec Population Health Research Network, and the Sherpa University Institute. And we hope to, through these webinars, to expand the training that we do in the McGill Summer Program in Social and Cultural Psychiatry, with a view to raise awareness of mental health disparities around the world and exchange social, cultural, and critical research in global mental health, building bridges across locations, across languages, across sectors. And I'm thrilled to have you all here today. Before I introduce our speaker, let me just give a couple of points about the webinar. As you've probably noticed or accepted, the webinar is being recorded, and we will be posted in our website together with some readings that our speaker has identified. The session will last about 75 minutes. We had to shorten it a little bit. And we will first have a presentation by Dr. Burgess, and we'll take questions and answers at the end. So take note of your burning questions. You can send them through the chat, or you'll have a chance to ask them directly at the end. Please make sure you're muted through the duration of the webinar until, of course, you want to ask your question at the end. And I think that's it for us. Let me introduce our speaker. Dr. Burgess, Rochelle Burgess, is the Deputy Director of the UCL Center for Global Non-Communicable Diseases. She's a lecturer in global health and director of the master's program in global health and development at UCL Institute for Global Health in London. She's a leading community psychologist specializing in community-led approaches to health in context of adversity. For the past decade, she has driven agendas to reimagine the role of communities in the movement for global mental health and acknowledge the importance of social interventions in addressing structural determinants of poor mental health. She has a PhD and master's in social psychology from LCE and a bachelor's in psychology from McMaster University. So very happy to have her with us today. She's also worked in a number of countries. Today she'll be presenting on her work in Colombia, but obviously informed by the work she's been doing in South Africa, Nigeria, the Kingdom of Eswatini, Zimbabwe, and the UK. We're very thrilled to have her with us today. She's a fellow Canadian joining us from the UK, so really pulling a long day from the other side of the ocean. Very happy to have you with us today, Rochelle. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's so nice to come home-ish. You know, I once upon a time, I suppose, as all Canadian high schoolers do, you think about universities you'd like to go to, or as many students do. And McGill was on my list, and I was not allowed to go because it was too far away. So I said to I should have showed my mom. I then moved to England and never came back. So, haha, mom, what did you see? You should have let me go to McGill. Would have ended up staying much closer. But I'm such a big fan of the work that comes out of your unit. Transcultural Psychiatry is such an amazing, spectacular, and important journal that I've been lucky to share some of my work in. So it really was an honor to be asked to come and speak today. Just as a bit of a caveat while I go to share my screen, is that I am currently sort of having a bit of a small bout of food poisoning. So that's why we have to end slightly earlier today. And that's why it's entirely possible that a lot of the jokes I make today won't land as well as they might have. But sort of just stick with me, and I'll try to sort of be as clear as possible and leave plenty of room for questions. So I suppose one of the things, the main thing I'm going to be talking about today is my project and work with colleagues at Universidad de La Sabana in Colombia, which is in Chia, just outside of Bogota. And it's a project that we did to work with internally displaced persons in sort of a region very close to Chia, in Cundinamarca, to try and sort of think about and make sense of how we could promote a more context anchored type of engagement to responding to the mental health consequences of conflict and sort of work in a post-conflict setting. And this was a pilot project that ran from 2017 to 2019. And it was really sort of the first time that we tried to sort of do something like this in terms of participatory engagement and as an intervention. So really pushing that boundary of intervention to try and look at, well, what happens if you sort of work in the community, in a general population where you know that there's a very high prevalence of various mental health conditions, common mental disorders in particular, depression, anxiety, and PTSD, and sort of work in ways that try to build community scaffolding around enabling people to have good mental health. Does that also potentially work as treatment? And so that's what I'll be talking about today. If I can get my mouse to the right side. And so to do that, I'll sort of go through sort of three broad areas. The first I'll talk about is a bit of context in terms of mental health needs in Colombia and sort of putting that into a sort of wider context other than just the conflict. And so the ways in which myself and colleagues have approached this work is sort of using a sort of more a paradigm of a post-accord rather than post-conflict to sort of try and reflect the complexities of sort of that transition from the signature of a peace agreement and the ups and downs as you try to sort of achieve lasting peace. And this is very much the case in Colombia, as we will see that it has not been a very smooth process even since the 2016 sort of landmark agreement. Next is looking a little bit at global mental health as a field and how participatory approaches help us potentially respond to some of the gaps and challenges that we see in terms of grappling with these wider social structural realities that are consistently linked to poor mental health outcomes in people's narratives and lived experience. Increasingly, sort of the science is starting to catch up to that with recent trials highlighting the efficacy of things like universal cash transfers and household grants at sort of enabling good mental health, looking at that poverty mental health nexus, but really sort of talking about how we need to go beyond that and sort of think in slightly different ways and how participatory approaches help us to achieve that. And then finally, I'll talk about the study itself and some of the sort of challenges and successes that we saw in trying to implement the work, but also in highlighting what we found in our community that we worked in. So when the peace agreement was signed in 2016 between government and FARC, which is sort of the largest guerrilla movement related to the conflict in Colombia and the oldest movement on the continent, there was sort of a very sort of deep hope that the end of about a conflict that had gone on for more than 50 years actively was coming to an end. But however, many argue that sort of the country has always endured cycles of violence since basically colonial times, but ultimately this particular conflict is the one in focus. And while there have been a lot of different issues as described and related to driving the conflict, people often talk about the sort of the role of the drug cartels, for example, versus paramilitaries. One of the areas where there is a lot of consensus about this is around unequal land distributions and the marginalization of particular groups in society. And so here we're thinking about sort of peasant farmer communities, indigenous populations. And so as a result, there's sort of like that conflict for about the last sort of 50 or so years, more than that now, I think coming close to 60. There were sort of the big groups in terms of the guerrillas, paramilitary groups, the army, and then increasingly sort of the drug cartels and traffickers. That sort of intertwined conflict has been responsible for creating nearly 9 million victims of a conflict, 8 million of which are also victims of forced displacement, which is one of the highest levels of displaced populations in the world, and largely displacements from rural areas to more urban settings. The peace agreement that was signed in 2016 was not the first attempt to achieve peace in the country, but it was the most significant and the closest that they got. But a referendum in 2016 on its ratification was voted down by an incredibly slim margin. And so the image here, which is sort of reflects how people voted in that referendum, really highlights how divided the country is on this particular issue. And it was lost by a very slim margin of only sort of 54,000 votes. And so this ultimately leads a picture of a very sort of divided society. And since the sort of this has fallen through, there has been sort of upticks in violence again in the last few years. 2019, FARC announced their remobilization. And this year, an organization called Indipaz, which is sort of a national monitoring institute, sort of studying and researching in areas of peace in the country, has recorded 77 massacres or outbreaks that have resulted in the death of over 300 people. So understandably, in this context, with the sort of movement towards the peace accord, the government has sort of let out and oriented a response towards acknowledging this large population of victims' challenges that they have faced through sort of implementing specific law that recognizes responsibility to provide various material, symbolic reparations for people directed by the conflict. And mental health formed a very large aspect of that. One of the reasons that they have been so interested in mental health as a particular manifestation of, or an outcome of the conflict to be considered within their sort of program for victim support called PAPSIVI, is, you know, that in the country they've had sort of successive national mental health surveys since sort of the 90s. The most recent one in 2015 had a representative sample of around 15,000 people, where they sort of looked specifically at outcomes related to the conflict and sort of identified that very large amounts of portions of the population had experienced a traumatic event. Nearly 20% of adults with sort of poor mental health outcomes were attributed to direct experiences of violence or experiences related to their forced internal displacement. And this is sort of paralleled with very low levels of access to services. So there was of the 66% of adults that requested access to services in the last 12 months, only 38.5% received those services. And this sort of picture has not really changed much since then. More recent evidence suggests that only 10% of people who are eligible to access sort of mental health supports in line with the PAPSIVI framework have done so. And it's very unevenly distributed across the country in terms of a rural and urban divide. But as sort of alluded to earlier when I started the presentation about this idea of a post-accord um, dynamic, there are needs to, and discussing the roots of the conflict, there are needs to look at how the conflict is essentially situated within wider histories of social inequalities in the country, fights for recognition of, and fights of recognition for certain groups within societies. So for example, there's very high levels of multidimensional poverty within the country that have sort of remained stable over the past sort of 10 years, around 20%. And this is in relation to issues such as education, literacy, access to health, and again, a very huge rural-urban divide. So the burden of multidimensional poverty is much higher in rural parts of the country. There's also sort of gender divides in terms of experiences of multidimensional poverty. According to UN Women Program in Colombia, 52% of those who live in poverty in the country are women. They're also more likely to have worse rates of underemployment and unemployment and sort of worse working conditions. And this sort of mirrors sort of a wider dynamic in the country in and around sort of other forms of gender-based violence. There's sort of very estimates of around 37% of women who have experienced acts of violence at the hands of a partner. The country also has very high rates of femicide, and in 2018, 32% of women killed were deaths that occurred in private spaces. This also sort of these issues also connect to sort of intersecting wider challenges. So one of which would be sort of, we think about shocks such as the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the economy. So globally, we know that more and more people will be pushed to extreme poverty, which is people living on less than $2 a day. In Colombia, we know that the people who are most likely to live in extreme poverty are those who are internally displaced by the conflict. In addition, it's thought that the entire economy will sort of contract by about 7.8%. And sort of adding on top of this is sort of intersecting forms of displacement, as Colombia is a country that takes citizens from neighboring countries who are also displaced because of sort of socio-political challenges. So Venezuela, for example, as of August 2020, there were reportedly of close to 2 million Venezuelans in the country, leading some organizations to have concerns about how stability will be maintained for all these different intersecting groups at such high levels of need. And what a story like this really points us to is the need to acknowledge in spaces where there are ongoing conflict, the presence of intersecting types of violences. There's a sort of very extensive literature that looks at the sort of varied nature of violence from sociology, political sciences, philosophy. I am not going to go into those kinds of details very much today, but I think I want to try and look specifically into two types of violence that are really quite clearly bound up with the conflict and also carry their own specific types of mental health consequences, at least as what we've seemed to have found in working with our community in the Cundinamarca department. And so essentially, we can sort of think about sort of physical, structural, and these types of violence on the slide as things that feed into and promote the expression of the other. So I think it becomes really important to pay attention, in particular, to structural and symbolic violences within the context of conflicts like that in Colombia. So in terms of structural violence, I think a lot of people are most familiar with it through Paul Farmer's work, but it sort of originates in the work of liberation theologists from the 1960s. Galtang, I'm never sure if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but structural violence is essentially understood as the violence inflicted by social injustice and experiences of oppression that are created by social structures that limit the ability of individuals to reach their full potential. they become and are seen as violent because they cause injury to others. And they cause injury to people in the same way that another violent act might do. So with specific impacts on health and well-being, and including psychological well-being. And I think one of the sort of big ways in which we see sort of structural violence manifest in the Colombian context is sort of what's been argued as being at the heart of the conflict. So this idea that there are groups that feel that they are politically repressed. And Martin Barro, another sort of liberation psychologist, he talks specifically about the structural violence inflicted by political systems and the way that the organizations of different legal systems can limit the actions of people, or used to sort of silence types of behavior that's thought of as antisocial, sort of like resistance types of behavior. And so he sort of makes this sort of comparison of how how people who are repressed find themselves opting for the lesser evil of a double bind. It is better to die fast from a bullet than slowly of hunger. And sort of the way that people sort of position and reposition their struggles in when all of these sort of intersecting difficulties are at play in their lives. So the next type of violence that I want to talk about is symbolic violence. This is rooted in Bourdieu's work. And he sort of argues that it's the type of violence that you see manifest and enacted between social groups, usually linked to exercises of positional or other forms of class-based power or other forms of positional power. And this form of violence is sort of the ways in which norms and practices limit the ability for certain individuals in society to live meaningful lives. So a clear example of that is sort of class-based discrimination. And it sort of tries to highlight the ways in which some groups in society are able to discriminate against others, stereotype them, or sort of minimize their sort of their lived experiences. So you can, in particular, we might want to talk about this. In Bourdieu sort of talks about this idea of social misrecognition. And so the way in which norms work to sustain or legitimize patterns of domination or oppression, even among those who have no conscious desire to do so. So how it sort of helps to explain how certain types of oppression may persist even after sort of the legal basis for them has been abolished. So even at the end of a conflict where things are supposed to have to be ended, there's sort of our ways of speaking, our ways of relating to each other maintain the opportunity for certain groups to be heard or not heard or misrecognized, which is something that can contribute to this experience of violence. And so ultimately what this sort of draws me to, or sort of my own work to, is the importance to acknowledge that we need to engage with the fact that all of these different forms of violence sort of come to work or be understood within a mental health paradigm. And so, you know, this is thinking about more than sort of PTSD or trauma conflict. This is part of it, but not the complete picture. And other scholars who have worked in Colombia, such as Von Bell, have argued about this sort of intersectionality of violences that we don't pay enough attention to. And the sort of recent COVID-19 pandemic has also drawn our attention to the fact that this is something that is a reality everywhere. There are drivers in society that act as forces of symbolic and structural violence in people's worlds through sort of leveraging structural and symbolic forms of power. And these very much manifest in how we need to understand responding to mental health challenges. And, you know, basic necessities, which people don't have the opportunity to access because of these types of violence at work, matter to somebody's mental health as much as being able to access psychological or psychiatric care. And so how do we create paradigms that enable us to do both of this necessary work simultaneously? So ultimately, this is a difficulty for the field of global mental health as a whole. I think one of the ways that it's manifest is in the debates around how we think about the relationship between poverty and mental health and adversity and mental health. And sort of Crick Lund has been attributed with a lot of sort of epidemiological work trying to highlight the presence of the sort of social drift and social causation pathways and the way in which they intertwine into sort of drive relationships between sort of structural environments and structural realities around poverty, and also the development and maintenance of poor mental ill health challenges. And one of the big gaps, I suppose, in the global mental health space at the moment is our ability to think through responses on both sides of these pathways. So we're very good at thinking about the mental ill health pathway and the fact that once you have a mental ill health condition or a mental health condition, you are more likely to drift into sort of economic and social challenges. So you're more likely to have disrupted education, fall into debt potentially because of sort of increased health expenditures depending on where you live. Stigma might contribute to loss of employment. These types of things sort of create economic vulnerability. But the side that we have been less good at is the social causation pathway, which is the purple one, which sort of looks at how life in sort of adverse structures of poverty, low violence, education, and the sort of bigger structural dynamics that drive us there, how we intervene on that side in order to enable responses. And I think ultimately the truth of this was sort of really brought home when the previous special rapporteur for the UN on the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest of standards of physical and mental health put us, when he gave his final report and gave his last speech sort of earlier this year, he spoke quite frankly about the gap in sort of global mental health response. So its focus has been on burden and cost of mental health disorders and sort of critique that this is not necessarily consistent with sort of human rights based approaches, and taking a more individualistic approach to the rather than a systemic one in relation to how these challenges come about. And I ultimately think that this sort of reality has been maintained by sort of an inadequate conceptualization of the social and the relationship between the social. So we are often quite good at thinking about socio-relational dynamics in society and families and households around individuals' poor mental health, and we can think about interventions and sort of support them around things like CBT and interpersonal therapy, problem-solving therapy that sort of deal with sort of cognitive and social relationships in society. And what I have argued along with others, such as Sumit Jain, Inga Peterson, and Crick Lund in a Lancet commentary earlier, what year is it? 2020. So it would have been, I think it came out in sort of like September 2019. Was that we're not as good at thinking about interventions in relation to the socio-structural. We're starting to get a little bit better. There are trials, and of which I sort of critique in some ways, and some I'm very happy to see, around sort of how sort of big policy level interventions such as cash transfers have impacts on population mental health, but we're not as good at bringing the socio-structural back down to the level of the person. So embedding these two approaches in understanding what counts as treatment. And so we sort of, in that paper and in another paper that came out this year, sort of looking specifically at how we might change this sort of picture as, you know, the COVID pandemic gives us all an opportunity to think differently about things, is we sort of argued that we needed to not only on one side have sort of good social policy at sort of like big levels. So thinking about things like debt relief and debt eradication in poor countries that allow them to mobilize funding for things like um, um, increased welfare support, universal cash transfers, social welfare grants, and investment in those kinds of systems on sort of the global scale. But nationally, we need to think about doing things differently. And in a lot of, in the UK, for example, the government response to sort of COVID-19 during the lockdown for people who were sort of very precarious was to give them advanced loans on their sort of universal credit rather than just increase their access to funding. And that's sort of contrasted with sort of what happened in Canada, for example, where everyone was sort of just given access to sort of the same amount of money as in, at least I believe that was very much the case in terms of discussions with my family around how that policy worked for them. And so really thinking about how good social welfare policies and social and economic policy leads to achievement of good mental health. And in addition to that is really trying to complicate this idea of the complex intervention. So how do we build interventions that are delivered in health settings or in community settings that um, don't separate the psychological from basic survival needs or the need to sort of develop the whole person. And so in a piece that's coming out, should be coming out, I think possibly early next year or late this year, depending on how quickly I'm able to get through final edits and changes, is that the way in which is thinking through the problem of how we get the interventions that we design to matter more to people. And I think in this piece and in my work in general, I argue that we do that through changing the way we approach design. So this is sort of adapted from the work of community psychologists Nelson and Protensky, who sort of wrote one of the classic texts on community psychology. And they sort of say that as a discipline, we tend to work within transformative approaches, and that they always sort of try to understand the assumptions and practices at work within how we typically engage with spaces and with people, and sort of move us into new areas and ways of doing that. For example, we, instead of defining the problem as in sort of individualist paradigms that focus on deficits and problems and can result in sort of victim blaming and separation of complex ideas, we try to reframe problems in terms of sort of diversity and social contexts, and also in bringing our attention to existing competencies and strengths that people already have at work and in sort of navigating their own survival every day, and then building and promoting and increasing that competency and wellness in their lives. And what that means is the way that we approach people is not towards thinking about things like compliance but through acknowledging and accepting people as active participants with self-direction and exercise choice, listening to rejections and to see what does a rejection of a program tell us about a program rather than what it tells us about a patient. And change the types of methods that we use to gather research to create more space for a variety of people to contribute. And sort of what I'll sort of focus on for a way forward in that vein is a framework called Community Mental Health Competencies that I first published in 2012 in an introduction to a special issue in transcultural psychiatry on the role of communities in global mental health. And so this is very much where a lot of my work takes its root, in working with communities to create scaffolding that is necessary to create mental health enabling societies. So thinking about what is needed for people to have consistent ownership over their life and their life and their health and outcomes across a range of sort of social realities. And so knowledge about mental health disorders and sort of mental health knowledge is one part of that, but that's the starting point. A big part of that is also sort of creating spaces for people to acknowledge and then deploy Indigenous knowledge um, in their lives. A second big point in this is the idea of creating opportunities to build solidarity and identify strengths. So this idea, again, of working through a positive and a survival-focused paradigm, and sort of creating solidarity between people who experience a similar situation to sort of tackle collective problems that come to impact on their well-being. In order to achieve that, we sort of suggest that this should happen within the context of dialogue and safe spaces to enable critical dialogue, critical consciousness, which is another sort of framework and paradigm which comes out of Latin America, Paulo Freire, and looking at the importance of sort of like critical education that allows people to make connections between their everyday survival and sort of wider structural realities, so that they can potentially, sorry, that's my trigger to make sure I don't spend too long talking about this slide, and it never works. And finally, partnerships, and the idea that we must always recognize that when we're trying to work with and enable groups who are typically oppressed or marginalized in society through vectors such as structural and symbolic violence, partnerships to people with key resources will always be a necessity during early parts of people's engagement to try and respond to distress. And one of the ways that I view research is an opportunity to do all of these things, particularly within the space of participatory methods. And so what I'd like to talk about now is sort of the idea of how participatory action approach aligns very well with trying to achieve these community mental health competencies in practice. And the paradigm has been applied in many different countries and contexts, and to try and sort of understand sort of community engagement around mental health. And one of the things that aligns all of these different studies in Rwanda and India, South Africa, the UK, and Colombia, now where I'm doing my most recent work, is that there is the idea of the collective at play in each of the spaces where we find competencies being developed. So participatory action research, I think some people, you're always unsure in talks like this, whether people come because they know what participatory action research is, or they come because they'd like to find out. So if you know lots about it, I will apologize in advance, but I will give a little bit of a background for those who don't. So it's under the huge umbrella of participatory methods, participatory action research is thought of as one of the more emancipatory forms of it. It also has roots in Latin America, Asia, and different parts of Africa, very much linked to and entwined with sort of social and political processes, and trying to create opportunities for people to participate in discussion and engage in different processes of empowerment through this approach. And at the heart of participatory action research is this process of continuous consultation, and that's sort of what drives it to be different from other ways that we might engage in research. And it was sort of the big part of liberation theology, as I've said, and it sort of really sort of is anchored to trying to acknowledge sort of different sets of knowledge that exist in the world, and how to avoid the ways in which certain knowledge paradigms, such as those that researchers trained in sort of higher income settings often carry, in ways that erase sort of indigenous knowledges. And so we wanted to sort of look at how we might promote the development of community mental health competencies among a group of internally displaced people in Colombia within this paradigm. And so this study, as I said, we carried it out from sort of 2017 and it wrapped up in 2019. And we worked at the level of general communities. So we wanted to see what would happen if you worked in a space where you knew a lot of people were very likely to have mental health challenges, potentially not die unbeknownst to them, but potentially sort of difficulties because of sort of these wider structural realities, and try to work with communities who essentially aren't a service user population, but there would potentially be overlap given sort of the experiences that they might be going through. And we worked with a group of people who lived in the Cundinamarca district, which is somewhere around here, I believe, just outside Bogota. It's traditionally a space where there are high levels of internally displaced people because it was consistently a zone without a lot of conflict in it throughout sort of the period of the active conflict. Even during the sort of recent outbursts, there have been very few, I think one of the 77 sort of incidents occurred in that region compared to sort of 13 or 14 in different parts where conflict was historically more embedded. And participants were randomly selected to participate from the sort of national register of victims who were being given support by sort of like the local department of sort of victim welfare, and also and also could gain access to support from the local university, La Sabana, who are the sort of lead partners on this in Colombia. And in addition to that, we had partners from the Center of National Historical Memory and sort of also the Department of Psychology at La Sabana, sort of realizing that that's cut off, and the Department of sort of Entrepreneurship also at La Sabana. So we had 41 people who were invited to the initial stages of the PAR project, and a total of 14 who finished, or no, 16 actually, who completed full cycles of the intervention and completed all data points. And we'll talk about some of the challenges around why that happened as we go on. So this is essentially sort of the project that we ran. We started off with this idea of systematizing experience. So we held sort of multiple focus group discussions with men and women in April 2017, where we sort of talked about people's sort of experiences of life in the town where they lived, and also created sort of opportunities to reflect on sort of big ideas such as mental distress, which we opted to use that term rather than introduce specific terminology around mental ill health conditions because of very high levels of stigma and very low uptake of services across the country really, but particularly among the group of victims, this population of victims. Yes, and so then also sort of the second stage after that was to sort of do a collective analysis. So we sort of went away and analyzed all the data from the focus group transcripts and then brought it back to a second set of groups. And at that point, 36 of the original 40 returned, and we engaged in sort of a group analysis workshop. It's been called member checking in sort of other paradigms, but really sort of trying to verify and ensure that the story that was emerging from these discussions, where we used various participatory learning and action tools such as Venn diagrams and tree of life, and sort of word association activities to sort of try and gather ideas about people's experiences and their understanding about terms such as mental distress. After that collective experience, we then worked to, we invited people back in January and April to sort of begin establishing reflection groups, which they sort of wanted to decide and prioritize action that they'd like to work on based on sort of our initial identification of challenges that they were facing and the realities that they were facing. And then the groups were left to run in a very open, sort of organic way. And we sort of decided that this was best because people's lives were quite flexible and they needed to be, we needed to make sure that we built the groups around what they were capable of doing. And a lot of people always would give precedence to sort of employment opportunities because work and labor is so precarious, sometimes difficulties with childcare. And so we wanted to ensure that people had as much opportunity to participate as possible. So we organized groups around people's availability. So we sort of ran those groups for about a year. And then by the time we sort of moved to the evaluation, which was done through Photovoice on April 19, a total of 12 people returned to participate in that. And then we sort of organized a sort of knowledge exchange meeting with sort of community members and partners, research partners. So this is example of our sort of word association exercise where we try to sort of systematize experience sort of and identify opportunities where, or identify sort of shared definitions of these big terms, sort of like emotional distress, mental well-being, recovery, which we thought would be sort of the big pieces of any sort of intervention. And after we sort of analyzed the work, we sort of brought back sort of cards where we had sort of written themes down, sort of the themes down for each area, sort of what are the things that are related to these issues, and then asked people to take the themes and put them back where they thought they matched. And we sort of had 100% sort of overlap in terms of how people said and described things and how we worked to sort of synthesize across the different groups. And sort of ultimately, one of the big things that we identified was sort of the ways in which displacement, despite having been in the new municipality for a decade, people are still sort of feeling the after effects of displacement because of the power and the importance of ideas of home and family and what that means to sort of creating a coherent sense of self and the way in which that is ultimately disrupted. So one of our big findings from that phase was that if we wanted to think about promoting recovery, many sort of traditional recovery paradigms would not work because they essentially remain, they don't appreciate the importance of issues such as political contexts, power differentials, as sort of in and around this type of symbolic violence in particular. Symbolic misrecognition was a huge point for men in our group who felt that they were unable to, they did not benefit from sort of the sort of narrative and the discourse around victimhood in the same ways that women did. And it was something that led to them being sort of ostracized or sort of excluded in their communities. And that was very much in relation to sort of the ongoing complexities of political context, where there were sort of beliefs that men who claimed to be victims were actually sort of guerrillas in hiding. And so the ways in which these different sort of discourses ultimately result in a misrecognition of people's needs and realities. And sort of identifying needs that went far beyond sort of psychological needs or even sort of everyday survival needs around sort of housing and food, those were present. But one of the biggest needs that sort of people highlighted was the ability to ensure that they were able to contribute to community in positive ways. And the best and the most important dimension of community for the community in this study was family. You know, family is the most sort of important social unit in Colombia. It's sort of been highlighted across a range of studies. And so it really sort of highlighted that any sort of mental health work that was gearing at sort of enabling recovery from trauma related to the conflict needed to think about recovery in a much more political and political way. So the next phase was sort of reflecting and choosing and taking action. And this, again, sort of linked down to these action groups. And so after the initial phase of work where we did sort of participatory learning and action activities, as I described, they started to develop priorities and then broke down into sort of smaller groups based on sort of shared interests for action. And so one of these was the sort of working around income generation activities and focusing on building up sort of small businesses and informal economic activities that some people have begun to engage with and wanted to strengthen. And then a second sort of group, which was a sort of a cultural celebration group where there was a focus on food and family and history and collecting and writing down recipes from home and the way in which home was sort of celebrated in order to do that. And a big part of enabling action to happen was to sort of bring in these outside partners to support that. So one of that in particular for the group working on sort of small businesses was to have sort of support and training from the sort of entrepreneurship department in La Sabana, who came and did training on the Canvas model, which sort of helped people to sort of set priorities and do planning and strategy to sort of identify skills, but also to identify sort of resources and they would need and potential outlets for resources, and sort of trying to sort of build more stable images of their sort of income generation activities. I think it's really important also to highlight here that there was a lot of overlap between these groups. So people would attend both. Some people attended just one, others attended both. And it was sort of we allowed that to happen sort of based on sort of a very organic principle about need. And finally, in this idea around evaluating action, thinking about the issue of Photovoice. And we worked with 12 of the 16 people who finished the entire pilot. And they completed a Photovoice evaluation of sort of trying to explore the topic of the impact of sort of engaging in these sessions on their lives. The average length of time for these participants in the community was 5 years, and the average age was 36. And there was a gender divide here as well, where it was over-representation of women. So we had 9 women and 3 men. And I think one of this sort of reflects some of the inequalities in society, in the sense that women are more able to come because they are less likely to have regular work. And also we ensured to provide sort of childcare to enable sort of women to participate. And so women were very happy that this was something that was on offer that they were able to take up so they could engage with it. And so in thinking through some of these challenges, one of our papers we've already published, we've got 2 in preparation, sort of the big team paper, which talks about sort of specific outcomes. To say at baseline of all of this, we measured PHQ-9 scores for the 40 participants because we wanted to be able to see if participation in this research exercise would essentially result in a reduction of sort of symptoms related to emotional to mental health problems, specifically to depression. And so PHQ-9 is sort of a tool used to measure depression in sort of primary care settings all over the world, and in Colombia as well. Specifically, but we also wanted to look at sort of wider dimensions of well-being. So we used 2 well-being scales. We used the social well-being scale by Corey Keyes, which has been validated in Colombia. And we also used the psychological well-being scales, which were developed by Carol Riff. And what those scales looked at are sort of this idea of the mental health side of the picture. So looking not just at mental illness, but sort of the dimensions that are bound up in sort of good mental health. So not just the absence of disease, but looking at these different factors that relate to sort of like coping and social integration. So the ability to feel, to experience social coherence and belief that, you know, there's strong bonds in the groups that you affiliate to, feeling that you're able to make a social contribution. So hugely being able to contribute to your household as identified as one of the big ones. Social actualization, so a feeling that your group can actually achieve things in society and sort of overcome that sort of symbolic misrecognition that often happens with oppressed groups. And in addition to these sort of more social dimensions, the psychological well-being scale sort of looks at sort of positive dimensions of personal growth, people feeling that they have mastery over their environments, positive relationships with others, and autonomy, things like that. And we found that our PAR cycle was able to do many of these things through achieving these different dimensions of the community mental health competencies framework. So in terms of knowledge, group members sort of highlighted through their Photovoice work that they developed not only more knowledge about sort of their own well-being, but also about sort of specific skill-related knowledge that they sort of were able to use and leverage in their own lives. And sort of this reflects dimensions of sort of environmental mastery and autonomy, and purpose in life, which was a huge one for people, saying they sort of felt that their lives had a new purpose, sort of a reimagining of sort of what some people have called cognitive scripts of social defeat, and sort of a reimagining of that script in their lives. They also talked a lot about the ability sort of to develop solidarity and strength, and sort of this was embodied in a theme of identifying new support systems and also solidarity in shared stories. So those 2 big themes really highlighted that people sort of valued the opportunity to talk to people who were going through similar struggles, and also connect those struggles to sort of bigger issues. And so in particular, one thing that comes to mind in this space was sort of one of our participants who spoke about identifying and identifying opportunities that they didn't know were previously available to them in terms of accessing services and support from the government that they didn't really know that they had the ability to access, through dialogue and talking to others in groups who had successfully done so. So the way in which that sort of like space created by the intervention and dialogue created through the methodology sort of created opportunities to sort of learn new skills and forge new strong bonds, and how that essentially links to dimensions such as social coherence and social integration, which were big markers in social well-being. And finally, sort of the idea of partnerships. So they really sort of valued not only making partnerships with themselves, between themselves, but also with the university, and sort of wider partnerships and strengthening partnerships with the department responsible for supporting victims in their community. And just to say, despite the fact that we sort of collected baseline data from sort of our big sample, one of the biggest challenges we faced was in sort of collecting ongoing data from these questionnaires, in the sense that people sort of really expressed that they did not like the idea of questionnaires, of data that sort of in a way went beyond them, that they couldn't maintain access to. And so there was a huge sort of pushback against that type of data, which we sort of respected and just sort of, you know, accepted that we wouldn't be able to sort of publish any sort of quantitative data around it, and sort of really sort of focusing on the sort of qualitative stories that this allowed us to tell. And so I suppose in moving forward, there were sort of big lessons that we learned. One of the biggest difficulties in an approach like this, working with a population like this, is sort of how do you maintain contact, and the question of engagement, and the question of do you need to maintain engagement. In a lot of ways, when we sort of followed up with people who sort of stopped returning, it was because things in their lives had changed, so they found stable employment, and this is something that made their lives better, and so they went to focus on that instead of returning back to these groups. And I think those are sort of successes rather than necessarily failures of an intervention. And sort of, you know, something about an approach like this is it potentially offers us a lot of similar outcomes in terms of sort of psychological and emotional gains, without leaving behind sort of the structural realities, and sort of maintaining people's ownership over defining how they work and what's important to them. So really listening and treating people as agents. And I suppose in moving forward with sort of work like this, we've just recently been awarded some new funding. Yay! To sort of try this again with a much larger sample of people. We're going to work in sort of 2 different parts of the country this time, and sort of try sort of a wider community approach, where we sort of deliver sort of discussion groups within. So it's a participatory action research project, but within that we'll use PLA cycles that are sort of defined by local groups during the participatory action research approach to develop this participatory learning and action intervention, collaborating with sort of new academic partners at the LSE, and sorry, I've just about lost my voice, so I might stop. But just to say that I think it offers us a very positive and exciting direction for sort of dealing with this problem of sort of structural and symbolic violence within, and its impact on mental well-being in ways that make sense for people, and sort of really excited to see where it goes. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you. And I say I'm speaking today on behalf of a really huge research team. We had an amazing group of students who sort of worked with us over those 2 years to deliver focus groups. My co-PI, Lala Fonseca, from Universidad de La Sabana, who is now at the LSE doing her own doctorate, and many others, and sort of more recent students who have helped us analyze data, including a student of mine from UCL who collected the Photovoice study data. So it's very much a participatory and community effort that I speak on behalf of today. So it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for your patience. I hope that my voice has not been too monotonic, because it's the end of the day and I'm flagging, but it would be great to hear from you in terms of questions. And I will stop talking and maybe somebody else will talk now.
Sure. Thank you, Rochelle. That was an excellent presentation. It really captured the complexity and the interconnectedness of all the structures and all the socio-political context that global health tries to respond to, and that I think should be also part of the solution and the systemic changes that we need moving forward. I have questions of my own, but I want to respect your request that we cut it a bit shorter today. I really appreciate the effort to get through the presentation. today when you were feeling a bit under the weather. So I'll open the floor for any of the participants. I know we have some students from Colombia. We have students who worked using participatory research in Guatemala. So I'll invite any of our participants to jump in and just put their mic on and ask your questions now.
That sounds great. Please do. You can put it in the chat or you can just speak up. Yeah, I think in the way in which I talk about the imaginary is just, it might be similar to what you're saying actually. So it might just be semantics, and maybe your way actually might be a better way of saying it. But it's the idea of sort of like a projected future. So like you just imagine, you're imagining a new life for yourself. So that's what's reimagined. It's about creating opportunities to see examples of that in practice. And I think that's what the intervention does. It allows you to live a piece of that, which makes it easier to then see it projecting into a future. Sandra Jovcelovic, Professor Jovcelovic, who does a lot of work in Brazil around in favelas, around sort of well-being, and has really sort of highlighted sort of the power of the imaginary and how important that is in sort of like the sort of imagining and in sort of a new self for people's sort of projects of change. And I've also sort of saw that in South Africa recently, linked to another intervention that I recently had the pleasure of evaluating, sort of a similar sort of pilot combined thing with sort of social development aspects involved. And we really saw that women, through doing things to plan for a new life, could see themselves in a new life. And so a previous framing of their life, because we sort of evaluated that with life history interviews. So it sort of transitions sort of a narrative of defeat to a narrative of hope. And that's sort of like that was sort of the biggest sort of psychological jump that we sort of saw in women's stories and interviews about themselves, in addition to because in that study we were able to collect data, which comes to your second question about trust. But in the South Africa study, we also saw hugely significant reductions in PHQ-9 scores, participating in sort of a similar sort of discursive intervention based around identity and combined with planning and work around economic development. And the economic development made a significant additional reduction. So independently and combined, it was very strong. But your second question around barriers to service and sort of lack of trust around being let down, I think that's very much what manifested in the project in terms of our inability to sort of collect more classic forms of quantitative data. They just don't trust, and they have every right not to trust it. And it was very much about not pushing those things. And so if, that's exactly the thing in sort of an ethics paradigm, people have to consent to fill out a form, and you can change your mind, you can change your consent. And so that's just it. And then you don't do it, but it sort of pushes us to think about the validity of those types of approaches in places where you're working with populations who have been consistently let down by state structures who collect data about them and then don't use it to help anything. So I think this issue of trust is a huge one. And we sort of found that because we allowed the engagement to run over such a long period of time, trust starts to build. Yes. So essentially, Photovoice is another participatory method where people are given cameras to sort of take pictures that represent their sort of answers to a particular question. So we're sort of given a question, and then they're given sort of instructions to go out and sort of take pictures or bring pictures in that help sort of explain their perceptions around this idea. And the study was carried out using sort of the classic Photovoice methodology with sort of the SHOWED acronym, which I cannot remember now off the top of my head what it's short form for, but it's sort of a structure that sort of explains what is done in each focus group discussion around sort of unpicking ideas and having more opportunity to discuss and share pictures and sort of establish shared themes around the stories that people tell through their images. And it's a very, I think one of the important things when doing participatory work is to ensure that the data that we collect is shared and engaged within a way so that people still feel close to it as part after the intervention is completed. Yeah, I think it's a really important question, actually. I think one of the challenges with this type of work is that it is gendered. You very often get lots of women participating and men not so much. It varies around the world to the degree, but I think in the different places I've seen it, that's very much the case, that men are excluded, probably because of the way that sort of men are framed in sort of a bigger sort of global discourse as sort of like perpetrators of inequalities in relation to women. So I think there's a lot of narrative in the global health discourse that leads us to overlooking men. One of the challenges that we faced, and I think I might have mentioned it, was that, and it sort of ties in with sort of like the wider norms around expectations of men in sort of Colombian society. That sort of came up in the work, and from my sort of time there, what I've sort of noticed that there are sort of huge responsibilities on men as sort of breadwinners and responsibilities over their households, and so a lot of distress that they when they talked about distress, it was around the ways in which society fractured their ability to do those things for their families and their households. So it wasn't surprising that men would choose to work rather than to sort of engage in these types of activities. So I think one of the ways that that needs to be worked through is in sort of discussion with men about what are the reasons why men don't engage, right? Because they will tell you. I think in our context it was that they had to work, or that they didn't sort of feel that it fit with their identity, really. But I think mostly it was around sort of economic responsibilities and the ways in which people set priorities for themselves and their time. And I guess for me, in sort of the next project that we're planning, we're going to organize groups by gender, which we did not do this time. We just sort of had mixed groups. And that was, we asked them in the beginning if they wanted to work separately, and they said no, like we're all the same here. But that was sort of maybe working in a much smaller setting. So the next study, which is a bit larger, we are sort of toyed with the idea of doing separate groups, and in the initial sort of scoping phase of the PAR cycle, one of the things we're going to focus on is sort of why, what would it take for men to be engaged in this type of work? And I think it's about asking those questions in the beginning before, sort of changing the way we do formative work. In a study that's sort of ongoing in Nigeria, before we started a trial, and it's a trial around participatory action cycles as well, we talked to nearly 400 community members in different parts of where we were going to deliver the intervention about what they thought the priorities of the intervention should be, and how they thought the group should run, and who should be in them, and how they should be organized. And we did that at scale because we wanted an intervention to run at scale. And I think very rarely in formative work do people work with 400 people qualitatively in discussion groups. We sort of treat qualitative formative work as like, I'll do 6 focus groups and that will tell me what I need to know. So I think we sort of also need to push ourselves in sort of thinking about how we pre-engage to sort of find the local answers to those kinds of questions. Thank you. It's such an important point. I could go on a million tangents about how men are now being left behind because of certain discourses, but I won't. The last question is always the biggest. That question is a talk entirely on its own. I will do my best because it's an important one. So you said some really important things in there that I just want to sort of pick up in my response. Sort of time, right? So this idea of like duration and time and how that is ongoing. Meaningful engagement and those are two of the big things for me. So I would always say, and they kind of relate to each other, if you have a long-term project that is truly participatory, and I say this to people and sometimes they think that I'm absolutely loco for saying such a thing. But if you don't feel that your project is going to fall apart at least once during your engagement, then it's not really participatory because you didn't give up any power. So unless you feel like the whole thing's going to fall apart, you didn't give up any power. There's no way in the life of a long project that everybody is going to agree all the time. There will always be tensions because you should be negotiating what counts as meaningful, what counts as important, and what the purpose of a project is. So if that negotiation process doesn't leave one or two or all partners at some point of feeling like, oh God, this is done, it's just not going to work, then it's not been participatory in a way that's about transformation, right? Because otherwise you didn't give anything up. You still hold all the power. And so I think because of that, what counts as meaningful engagement will always change based on people's responsibilities or priorities at a given time. And so as we sort of exist in a sort of COVID pandemic, where there are, as they say in Haiti, crisis upon crisis or disaster upon disaster, then you need to have flexibility about what meaningful engagement means at any given time in your project. Maybe people are only giving what they have the capacity to give at that point in time because of everything else that's happening. One of the big tensions for us as researchers is that we live in time-bound worlds. Research projects have funding start dates and funding end dates. We very rarely get a project funded for 10 years. You know, I evaluated a co-production project in London that was transformative. And the reason it was transformative is that they've been working on it for a decade. A decade is how long it takes to truly transfer power relations between the powerful and those without power. It took 10 years. And then they got to a point where they could be transformative. And I suppose in a way, we have to treat how we work and think about time and scale and sort of potentially work to adjust our priority as needed, or think about sort of multiple goals. Some of them are short-term, some of them are long-term. And that process of negotiating them should always be collective. So I think communication is and real communication is the only way to really do that. And you know, I guess, and I think there's no really easy fix for that. But I think it's all we have until we get other levers to change, like we get projects that are funded for 10 years rather than 2, or we, you know, we sort of make it the norm that you develop long-term relationships with the groups that you work with. in certain places, in certain spaces, with the purpose of sort of ongoing change over many, many years. And in terms of young people, I mean, the work that I've done in Colombia in that pilot was not with young people. Everybody, like sort of the average age was in their 30s. But I definitely think that in terms of working with youth and young people, there's a huge potential and huge opportunity to do that. And I think also an opportunity to think through some of these sort of tried and tested methodologies that we have at our disposal. I think they could look different. I think young people can tell us, like, you know, is this going to work? Is it not going to work? Some stuff that I did recently with young people in London on a story completion project. We did the whole thing online because it was conducted during the COVID-19 lockdown in the UK, but we've sort of continued to sort of engage with each other through WhatsApp, and those groups sort of will outlive the project. And I think, so, yeah, I think I'll stop.
Well, I'd like to really thank you. We started with a warning that it'd be a shorter session, and in the end, we can tell you're so passionate about it because we lost track of time, and we're even past the 90 minutes that we originally planned for, which tells us that not only research is an intervention, but this is a life commitment, and I really appreciate you being with us today, sharing the exciting work, offering to follow up with the questions that will certainly come your way. Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.